Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope this video finds you well. Today, if you don't mind, I would like to share with you a few thoughts and comments that I have with respect to a very interesting film that was initially released in the world for the first time in the year 1969. The film is directed by Kiju Yoshida. The film is called EROS plus MASSACRE. So I mentioned that this film was released in the world for the first time in 1969, and it was then released in Japan in 1970. So that's why you'll sometimes see it referred to as being a film from 1969 or a film from 1970. In fact, I think David Desser, in the essay that's included in the book, which is part of this limited edition release of this set, cites it as being a film that was released in Japan in 1970, whereas other parts of this book label it as being a 1969 film. So in any event, we're talking about 1969 or the late 1960s with respect to this film EROS plus MASSACRE, or in Japanese EROS plus Gyakusatsu. This is a very long film, and if we're talking about this particular Arrow Academy release, as you may know, the release includes not one version, but two versions. So we have the director's cut version here, and then we have the theatrical version here. Now the theatrical version runs 164 minutes according to the back of the disc, and the director's cut version runs 215 minutes. So when you're talking about the theatrical version, we're talking about 2 hours plus, and when we're talking about the director's cut, we are talking about over 3 hours. So there is a significant difference in running time with respect to both versions. Now, before I get into the film proper, let me just say that, generally speaking, the Arrow Academy set is absolutely stellar. It is absolutely stellar for many reasons. I think primary in which is the fact that it includes both versions of the film. Now, the question might arise for anyone who is new to the works of Yoshida, and or anyone who is new to the film EROS plus MASSACRE and have yet to see it. Which version should you try first? Should you try for the shorter theatrical version, or should you try for the longer director's cut? Now, I would say that generally speaking, it is widely acknowledged that the longer director's cut is considered to be the more, let's say, accurate or form of the film. In other words, it's the form of the film that is closest to the original vision of the director, in certain ways, of course. And I think, therefore, it might be said that the director's cut would be the version to watch if you're going to watch this film. And I see no reason why one should be nervous about this, because in fact it is a really fascinating work that is further made fascinating by the fact that we're getting what is purported to be the director's vision in the director's cut. And so I would actually recommend going for the director's cut if you're going to try to approach this film. That being said, I do not think it is an unwise move to opt for the theatrical version either. Now, there are some differences, some significant differences between the shorter theatrical version and the longer director's cut. And indeed, most of those differences are highlighted in the scene select commentary that is provided by David Desser on the director's cut release or disc of the set. So you are able to get a kind of comparative analysis as to the similarities and differences between the two versions. Also, in that analysis, I think one finds that there are indeed differences that benefit the longer director's cut version. But there are also instances where it could be said, or it could be argued, that the differences between the theatrical version and director's cut are such that for at least some of them, some of the choices made with respect to the theatrical version, the shorter version, create an effect or give an effect for the film that is in some ways stronger or more memorable. That's not true for all the changes, but for some of the choices that are made, it can be argued, I think very reasonably, that the shorter theatrical version has certain choices that are maybe artistically more effective. But that is, of course, in the eye of the beholder, and I think maybe to take a step back, as a general premise, I would say that even if one went with the theatrical version, I think one cannot go wrong with that. I think, in general, the principles that are laid forth in this film, I think, are solid and solidly presented in the theatrical version as they are in the director's cut, albeit the director's cut elongates them and further strengthens those solid foundations. That being said, there are strengths and benefits to the theatrical version, and so I think it is also okay if one opts for the theatrical version going forward. Incidentally, before I continue with the film, let me say that the Arrow releases here are magnificent in many respects. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, the two versions are included. Not only that, we get, for each version, we get a short introduction given by David Desser. And this is great because David Desser is a Japanese cinema scholar, and he is also an expert when it comes to new wave cinema from Japan. And in particular, he's an expert when it comes to the works of Kiju Yoshida, or Yoshige Yoshida, as he is sometimes referred. And in fact, the book that David Desser wrote in English, which is called EROS plus MASSACRE, an introduction to the Japanese new wave cinema, is in fact the title of which is taken from the film EROS plus MASSACRE. So that is a sort of indication of how much David Desser is a great admirer of the works of Yoshida, and this work in particular. And so it's nice to have David Desser's own words to hear in the introduction that he has for the theatrical version and the introduction that he has for the director's cut version. What is more, David Desser, for each version, gives a sort of scene select commentary. This is to say that this is not a full commentary track for the entirety of the running time of the films. No. These are only commentaries given to select scenes from each version. So in fact, the total amount of running time for the commentary tracks themselves is not long relative to the length of the films themselves. So you have to go to a separate section in the menu, click on the commentary track section, and then you can access the commentaries for the specified scenes that fall within the film. The scenes that he gives commentaries for are pretty much spread out through the film, and so you're getting a kind of a full arc of a commentary track that covers, I think, many of the basic points that David Desser covers in his written essay, which is included here, and also in the writings that he includes in the book EROS plus MASSACRE. And so I think the commentaries themselves, while they aren't over the entirety of the film, which of course would have been ideal, nonetheless serve a great purpose, because we see Desser's enthusiasm for the film. He's obviously very expert in the imagery and the flow and the characters, and so if one has difficulty in trying to figure out who is who and what's going on, which I think is a great possibility for Yoshida's works, because there is a lot of visual imagery that is very challenging and very potentially confusing. And so to have David Desser there to guide us in the scene select commentary is incredibly helpful. And so I would recommend very strongly that if you've seen the film and if you're interested in trying to further deepen your knowledge and of the film and what the specific aspects that are involved, then I would strongly recommend going with the scene select commentaries for the works. Now, when it comes to that, I should say that there is this kind of from my point of view, a sort of natural flow of things, in that it seems to me that he starts, David Desser in his scene select commentary seems to start the theatrical version commentary on the basis that he will later talk about the director's cut. And so the fundamentals of his discussion of the film tend to be found on the scene select commentary that is found on the theatrical version disc of the Yoshida set from EROS. So if you're interested in hearing a scene select commentary, I would suggest going for the theatrical version scene select commentary first. And then, after you're done with that, you can go to the scene select commentary that he gives for the director's cut version, because in this scene select commentary, David Desser focuses primarily on the differences. He gives scene select commentaries for those scenes that are included in the director's cut but aren't necessarily included in the theatrical version. And so it provides a wonderful comparative analysis. In other words, it provides a way in which one can further understand and appreciate what the differences are and how those differences affect the overall impact of the film. And so you get in other words, you get the base commentary information here, and then you get the commentary regarding the differences and how that impacts the film here. So my suggestion, therefore, would be start with the theatrical version scene select commentary, and then go to the director's cut scene select commentary if you're interested. Incidentally, I should reiterate that each version comes with its own introduction from David Desser, and so he gives an introduction for this, and he gives an introduction for this, and so they are both different and tailored to the particular versions. And so I would also recommend going with the introduction that David Desser gives for the theatrical version, and then going with the introduction that David Desser gives to the director's cut version, because there is a sort of flow to that. For whatever reason, the David Desser materials that are presented for the director's cut seem to be based on the premise that the theatrical version supplements will have been seen first. So I would therefore go with the theatrical version and the director's cut version if you're going with the exploration of the supplemental material. And then to round out that discussion, nothing else is included in the director's cut disc, but what is included with the theatrical version disc is an approximately 30-minute documentary which is discussing Yoshida, and in particular Yoshida and the context of this film, EROS plus MASSACRE. And then we have two film critics, Mathieu Capel and Jean Duchet. And also we have Kiju Yoshida himself speaking about the implications of this film, what this film seems to be about, what Yoshida seems to be doing in this film as an artist, etc., etc. So this is a great documentary to have, and it is a sort of wonderful supplement to watch upon viewing the film. And so it's a fabulous presentation. And so once again, my friends, I would suggest going for something like this. So bear with me. If you're going to watch the film and you're watching it for the first time, try going for the director's cut, although I think it's perfectly okay if you start with the theatrical version as well, although I would tend to lean slightly towards watching the director's cut. Then, if you have time, try watching the other version, or as much of the other version as you can, and or if you are then interested in going through the supplemental materials, I would then, with great respect, suggest that you start with the supplemental materials from the theatrical version, and then you migrate over to the supplemental versions of the director's cut disc from the Aero Academy set. So it's a little bit confusing, I know, but that's just to say that there's a lot of material here, given the fact that there are two separate versions of the film. So I think the fact that we have both versions available in this single set is fantastic. And then, of course, we should not forget the booklet that is found in the limited edition release of this. Now, I understand that the booklet is not made available except in the limited edition, and so if you're able to get this in the limited edition with the booklet, and you can confirm that the booklet is included, and you can get that without necessarily spending too much money, then I would really strongly suggest this. As I mentioned in an earlier video, this booklet contains 3 essays, each of which is so on point, and in particular they talk about many things that are of course relevant to Yoshida and EROS plus Massacre. So the first essay is called Yoshida, A Career by David Desser, which is going through the filmography of Yoshida very briefly, including of course EROS plus Massacre. And so in that essay you can kind of get a sense of the development of Yoshida's career leading up to EROS plus Massacre, because as some of you may know, Yoshida has had a very he had made a lot of films in the 1960s up to the making and release of EROS plus Massacre in 1969, and so that is a very interesting overview, and it's a very good overview to give us a kind of context as to how this film fits into the Yoshida filmography, which is a very important context, I think, to have. And then there's another essay which is called The Revolutionary Triptych, which is by Isolde Standish, and this is really great because this deals with the sort of the themes and topics that are being discussed in the 3 films included in the box set, included in which, of course, is the film EROS plus Massacre. And she talks about the idea of the freedom of artistic expression that was given to Yoshida in terms of his being sort of freed from the studio system, as it were, and being able to give full body to his artistic expression, what he wanted to express. And the subject of his artistic expression, of course, here is the subject of Sakae Osugi, the personage of Osugi, who is the figure from the Taisho era, that is the sort of the central figure, if you will, of the past scenes set in the past of EROS plus Massacre in the Taisho era, and his relationships with a number of people, included in which, of course, is Noe Ito, the woman Noe Ito, and also the woman whose name in the film is Itsuko Masaoka. And so this is the focus of the film, and it is the political and societal significance of Osugi as a real-life personage in history that forms sort of the basis, if you will, of the political nature of this film. And I'll try to get to that later in this video. And I think the essay, which is included in the booklet, right, deals with that quite well. It also talks about the other films and the implications of their dealings with and their discussions of political history and the descriptions of political history in a cinematic form. And so I'm very much taken with this essay, and I would strongly recommend a close examination of this if you are able to. Once again, it's called The Revolutionary Triptych by Isolde Standish. And then finally, there's the essay by Dick Stegewerns, which is called Kiju, Yoshida, and ATG, the Reluctant Partner. And this is talking about ATG, Art Theater Guild, which was a very important sort of a company or entity that was helping at first with the distribution in Japan of so-called art house films from outside of Japan, to show these art house films in Japan in a chain of theaters. That was a very big deal in the sort of early 1960s. But then this developed, ATG developed into its own sort of production company, in a sense. Well, not production company, but it was in a sense helping to plan and fund the making of films in Japan of certain people that were selected through a sort of rigorous selection process and were given a certain amount of funding from ATG, and they went off and made these films that were then distributed through the ATG theaters. And so this created a kind of system of Japanese independent cinema that covered all strands of that moniker. So independent cinema, art house cinema, sort of political revolutionary cinema, avant-garde cinema, and the like, that really came to the fore in many respects on the sort of Japanese independent art house scene, starting from the late 1960s and really gaining prominence all the way through to the early to mid 1970s. It still went on after that, but arguably the golden years, so to speak, of the ATG films came during the late 60s and early 70s. And so EROS plus Massacre and Heroic Purgatory and Coup d'etat, the films that are included in the Yoshida set, they fall within that period. Now there is a little bit of detail in terms of what is an official ATG film and what isn't, etc. And so there is a little bit of ambiguity as to the place of EROS plus Massacre in the context of ATG's filmography. And those details, I think, are covered quite nicely in the essay that is dealt with, that is included in this booklet. The essay also talks about the other ATG films that Yoshida made, which were these films, and there are a number of others as well. And so I think this essay is really wonderful to have and wonderful to read if one is interested in the context of ATG and Yoshida and what ATG actually was and what it stood for and what it did for Japanese cinema during this time, and how Yoshida either went along with that or sort of resisted that, and what were the specifics of those circumstances vis-a-vis Yoshida. So it's a great essay to have, and so this is another great supplement, which is this booklet for the limited edition. So if you can get this booklet that comes with the limited edition release of the box set, then I would strongly recommend it, because these are some of the best writings that one can find in English on Yoshida in this compact volume, and so strongly recommend it. Okay, so now let me talk about this film and some details about the film and how I feel about the film. Now, I will be talking as generally as possible, but I will still be talking about things that might be considered to be spoilers. So if you are wary of even hearing something that could be even akin to or construed as being a spoiler, then I would actually suggest to stop this video now and watch the film, the theatrical version or the director's cut version, whatever you prefer. And then you can come back, and at that time I would love to hear your thoughts and comments about this very interesting work, EROS plus Massacre. So if you haven't seen the film and you don't want to be spoiled, or you don't want to run the risk of being spoiled, please stop this video now. So from here on, I will be talking about the film. I will try to be as general as possible, but there still might be some spoilers in my discussion. So if you haven't seen it and don't want to be spoiled, please stop this video now, and I will see you hopefully very soon later. Okay. Let me say from the outset that I think this film is understandably one that seems to be somewhat intimidating and overwhelming for someone who's coming to this film for the first time, for anyone who is new to the works of Yoshida, and for anyone who is, let's say, new to Japanese cinema or otherwise doesn't necessarily feel that he or she has a comfortable grasp upon the specific aspects of Japanese history and Japanese politics that this film seems to be tackling. And so if you are feeling in that position, let me say that I completely sympathize, because I also do not necessarily consider myself to be any expert in terms of Japanese history, or Japanese politics, or Japanese political history. So I don't know all the details as much as I should, perhaps, and that's on me, of course. But I think that, in fact, the film, whether it be the theatrical version or the director's cut version, I think the film itself does have the potential of acting in a way that is that can give a very potentially beneficial and rewarding viewing experience to someone, even if one doesn't necessarily have the specific background information with respect to Sakai Osugi or Noe Ito or the Amakasu incident or the state of student demonstrations in the mid to late 60s and the demoralization of that movement, arguably speaking, in between 1960 and 1970, which were very key years in terms of the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty, etc. And other related events, the Kanto earthquake of 1923, etc. And I think these are, of course, events that are alluded to and personages that are alluded to in the film, of course. And they are, of course, very significant. But let me say from the outset that I think that the film can be seen and appreciated on a purely, let's say, visual level, on a purely intuitive level, because there is so much in Yoshida's camera work and his camera movement and his editing and his elliptical nature and style that creates a lot of mystery, a lot of intrigue, and a lot of beauty, in terms of the framing of his shots and the way that characters are framed within certain pieces of architecture or alongside certain curvatures or shapes that are found either in nature or that are man-made. The way in which characters interact with each other, the way that characters from different time periods interact with each other, the way in which memory and the past and the recreation of the past is used in a kind of intriguing way. All these aspects, I think, are examples of how this film can be seen and I think can be appreciated without necessarily having all the details of the relevant historical events under one's belt, if you know what I mean. And so I think there is much to be admired as a kind of cinematic, poetic, almost avant-garde work of art. And in that respect, I think this can be appreciated on a sort of gut level, and on a sort of an exploration of the mise-en-scène and the way in which the narrative seems to be propelling in certain ways and others. And so I think this kind of film studies analysis applies very nicely to this, especially because the film gives us so much visual imagery and a lot to work with. So this is, I think, on a very strong level, a place that I think people, myself included, can really begin to try to understand and appreciate this work. Again, on this very sort of intuitive or instinctual level that is still very, very significant and very important when one is watching a film. That being said, of course, I think also that the more that one knows about the relative or the relevant events in history and the personages in history and the movements in history that are being discussed or that are relevant to the storylines of this film. And when I say storylines, I mean both the contemporary storyline, which is in the late 60s, with focusing on the Eiko character, the young woman of Eiko, and her storyline with Wada and the filmmaker and others. And also the storyline of Osugi and Noe Ito and Masaoka, and to a certain lesser degree, Osugi's wife, Yasuko Hori, and other personages in the Taisho era portion of the film. And so you have these two storylines, and each storyline, I would suggest, has its own significant events in history that become significant and relevant when thinking about this film. So if you're talking about the Taisho era storyline, then you're talking about many events in history, but of course included in those personages that I just mentioned, you're talking about, for instance, the way in which feminist thought was growing and developing, as exemplified by the Seito or Blue Stocking magazine and the group and the intellectual group that gathered around there, and that's part of that storyline there. There's also, of course, the significance of Osugi himself and what he represents in terms of the focus on sort of individualism over the hegemonic family state, and his individualism, which is rooted in both sort of intellectually grounded individualism and also an emotionally or passionate based individualism, is exemplified in the film by his quote-unquote free love approach to life, right? And how he wants to love many women at the same time, which is, as I say, grounded in a sense of individualism on the one hand, because he seems to be guided by a set of principles or rules when it comes to this free love on the one hand, but it also is guided by or propelled by a sense of passion or emotion, which I think is very much an important part of his role and his significance in that particular part of the film. And then, of course, you have other incidents like the Kanto earthquake of 1923, which is sort of mentioned in the film, but it's not directly dealt with in the film. And you also have the Amakasu incident, which is also in 1923, which is also very significant in terms of what that meant to the lives of Noe Ito and Sakai Osugi and Osugi's nephew. And then those incidents, I would suggest, are sort of obliquely referenced, although they are very significant in the biographical history of Osugi himself. The other main event that is of great significance is the what's called the Hayama incident, or the Hikage incident, in 1916, with regard to the tea house incident and what happened and what transpired between Sakai Osugi on the one hand, and in the film the character is Itsuko Masaoka, one of Osugi's lovers, and what transpires between the two of them at the tea house incident. And this, in fact, forms one of the key moments, or one of the key sequences in the film, as you know. And so this is also a very key moment that is very important. So that is the general background of the Taisho era storyline. And when you go to the contemporary storyline in the late 1960s with Eiko and Wada, the young man, and also the filmmaker and all those stories, but I think primarily speaking, the young woman of Eiko, we are talking about contemporary Japan. We are talking about a Japan that is obviously going through sort of a societal turmoil in certain respects. There is, on the one hand, a further development of the relationship between the United States and Japan, that of course was in the form of the end of the war, the Second World War, and the end of the occupation, post-war occupation in the early 1950s, that led to the sort of U.S.-Japan military-based relationship that culminated in the sort of the re-signing of the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty in 1960 and its renewal in 1970. And these events are also tied with the changing state of the global stage, if you will, the rise in tensions in the Cold War, the Korean War and the Asian theater, the Vietnam War. And this, of course, meant that for a lot of people, and especially a lot of students in Japan, there was much strife in terms of the U.S. presence and what that symbolized, and the rise of nuclear power, and also the rise of military force that were sort of proxy wars in the context of the grand history of the Cold War. And there were many protests against this. And so I think the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was a very stark symbol of this. And so this was the symbol against which many students participated in demonstrations, which then later gradually developed or devolved up to 1970 into more radicalized or more violent demonstrations. And so this is the sort of situation that the student movement, if you will, found itself in the late 1960s, approaching the renewal of the treaty in 1970. And so you had renewed tensions, although there is an argument to be made that although the tensions might have been seen to have been somewhat maybe radicalized or maybe more propelled or maybe reliant more on violence, it could also be said that ultimately the effect of the student protest movement in the late 1960s compared to the late 1950s and early 1960s might be seen to have lessened in power and effect. So there is, in a sense, a sort of moment of demoralization. There's also a sense of not necessarily feeling like there is sort of impetus or pressure or an effect that there once might have been in the early 1960s. There is less of a feeling that perhaps the sort of the culture or a kind of sweeping revolution will take place. There is less of a feeling perhaps that these sorts of protests will have any weight or have any long-lasting effects, etc. So there is also a kind of a demoralization setting in. And I would argue that that theme, even in a very oblique and ambiguous form, does exist in the contemporary storyline of the film EROS plus Massacre. And I think those aspects, therefore, and others, of course, but those aspects in particular, I think, are very important when trying to consider the contemporary storyline going forward. Okay, so that's a very brief overview of what I consider to be just general points, milestone points in the historical background that I consider to be significant when it comes to these two storylines. Now, what I think is very significant about the way this film operates and these sort of two storylines, and they're not just only two storylines, but there are the past and the present. And so there is a sort of dialectical discussion going on between how the past is being presented and it's being recreated on screen, and also how the present seems to be interacting with or having a discussion with or trying to grapple with or trying to understand the implications that arose with respect to the past. And what does that mean specifically? Well, it seems like if we're talking about the contemporary storyline that is trying to come to grips in some way, in some kind of student protest type of feel, which is protesting somehow against a sort of hegemonic, dominant, and growingly dominant viewpoint in sort of establishment Japanese politics, namely and primarily the Japanese conservative state and its relationship with the United States and the military-industrial complex, etc., then we can see that perhaps this sort of student movement can be seen to be trying to voice a protest against that establishment, right? And if that is the case, then the juxtaposition between this storyline, the contemporary storyline, is with the past storyline is very important, because if we think of the contemporary storyline in those terms, then we can also think of the past storyline in terms of something similar, namely a kind of resistance against an establishment. Now, what would it be in the past storyline? In the past storyline, we must remember the figure of Osugi, what he represents. And if he represents a kind of free love take on human individualism and the importance of human individualism vis-a-vis the so-called family state, or the traditional formally feudalistic hegemonic state of Japan, right, then we can understand that Osugi's way of life and his intellectual thinking, and therefore his own personal existence, really came in contravention against this sort of family state. And I think that is very significant, therefore. So there is a sort of resistance against the establishment in both timelines. And I think that is something that is very important to keep in mind. Now, the way that it works out in the Taisho era, or the early past storyline, I think is very significant, because it plays out in a very complicated way, and I don't want to necessarily suggest in my own very limited and maybe inadequate way of describing it. I don't want to suggest that it's a very overly simplified version of the past. On the contrary, the way in which this sort of individual versus the establishment type of dynamic is established in the early plot line, it's very, very complicated, and it's much more complex than my description is giving it credit for. And that is because there is also room to understand that the idea of factionalism is coming into play within this dynamic of Osugi versus individualism versus the sort of hegemonic state, as it were. And that is expressed by his trying to cling to free love, right? And what is free love in his terms? Well, free love is basically defying the rules, the traditional rules of marriage, and it's instead going with one's feelings and one's wants in having more than one sort of emotional partner and more than one sexual partner, and not necessarily feeling the need to be legally bound or financially obligated with respect to these various relationships. So this is a so-called free love approach of Osugi, and I think you can see that this sort of runs against the sort of traditional notions of relationships between human beings, marriages and the like. And I think that is the struggle between sort of the tradition family state on the one hand and Osugi's free love individualism on the other hand. And that is the struggle. That is the core of the Taisho era storyline, in my opinion. And this gains, I think, a very political flavor, of course, for a number of reasons. First, because, of course, Osugi as a figure, both in how he's described historically and also how he's described by film critics in the film supplements and by the Arrow Academy set, etc., he's described as being an anarchist. And also the word revolutionary is used. Revolution, anarchism is used. Well, what does those words mean, and what are the implications of those words in the context of this film? And this is very important, I think. The implications of those words, I think, are twofold. They have, both of them, a very political implication, a political nuance, a political meaning. But they also have a meaning that is more than political. They have a meaning that is also very much more intimate than that. It is more emotional than that. So this idea of, for instance, a revolution can be a political revolution, but also can be a sort of individualized, intimate, emotional revolution. The same is true for anarchy. There can be political anarchy, but there can also be a sort of individualized or emotional sort of anarchy. And I think the fact that you can have these dual meanings is a wonderful way to view the Osugi storyline in EROS plus Massacre. One of the key moments in the film is when there's a description. Politics is personal, or personal is the politics. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but the point is that the politics of the film, or the Taisho section of the film, are in a sense being presented through the personal actions and the personal storyline of Osugi himself vis-a-vis his wife and his two lovers, and his way of life. And so his way of life is in itself a sort of political act, right? And I think that is really fascinating to look at. And it works well in the context of this film. And especially when we think about politics in a very, maybe not necessarily simplified way, but another way to look at politics is, politics can be described as being the way in which we look at the world, or maybe another way to describe it is politics is the way in which we would like to think the world should be. Okay. And so if that is the case, then that is a very personalized view of the world. And to describe politics like that, therefore, is very consistent with how the film, Yoshida's EROS plus Massacre, seems to put the focus on Osugi and his personal life in the context of the relationships that he had with Noe Ito and Itsuko Masaoka. And also, of course, his wife, Horiyasuko. So this is, I think, very, very significant. The personal becomes the political. And that is, I think, the key crux of the early Taisho era storyline of the film, which is also very significant because if you know your history, then you will know that with respect to Osugi's life, the Kanto earthquake in 1923 and also the Amakasu incident in 1923 are very, very significant moments in the lives, in the biographical details of both Noe Ito and of Sakai Osugi. And if you know that, then you'll probably be struck by the fact that the film doesn't necessarily put those events at the focus of the Taisho era storyline, which is a very interesting choice to make. But in fact, the focus of the storyline seems to be more on the Hikage tea house incident of 1916. And so that is, I think, very much in keeping with what I think is a way of looking at that early part of the film, which is a focus on Sakai and his relationships with the women in his life, because his relationships form the basis of his free love existence, his personal existence. And if we understand that the personal life is politics, then therefore his relationships with these women is itself political. And the tea house incident of 1916 is sort of the climax, if you will, of those relationships, or at least one of them anyway. And so, therefore, I think the fact that the film focuses in on this tea house incident of 1916, more so than, say, the Amakasu incident of 1923, is very, very in keeping with what I think the film's trying to deal with, namely, politics is personal. So that is, I think, the way in which one can see the early or the Taisho era storyline of the film. But that brings us also to the contemporary storyline of the film. So what does this mean? Because we have this young woman at the center of this storyline. Her name is Eiko, and she seems to be of a number of different aspects to her character, right? On the one hand, she is seemingly trying to discover or study or learn more about the personage of Noe Ito, who is one of Sakae Osugi's lovers, and who she was, what she was about, what she believed in, and her relationship with Osugi and others, of course, and her role in the Seito Bluestocking literary movement, and also her role, therefore, in the sort of progressive thinking and writing when it came in literary circles, in particular with respect to ideas on feminism, and how they are trying to evolve these ideas, especially considering that Japan had only recently come out of its sort of feudalistic history, but still perhaps was very strongly in a sort of feudalistic hegemonic mindset that was not very friendly towards equality of the sexes. And so this figure of Noe Ito, therefore, is very important, and I think it becomes the focus of the interest of the young woman, Eiko, who is, very arguably speaking, the main character of the modern era storyline of the film, EROS plus Massacre. But what is that whole thing about, right? And I think the way to look at this contemporary storyline is, in essence, how the contemporary storyline connects with or interacts with the Taisho era past storyline. And I would argue that the way in which the past and the present collide in this film is not merely a sort of dialectic. In other words, it's not merely the case of the present giving way to flashbacks in the past. No. It's nothing like that at all. It's actually much more complicated than that. It's in fact a kind of cohabitation, or a kind of relationship between present and past that is almost multi-dimensional. And what I mean by this is, in many aspects of the film, you'll see people in the present talking about the past. Maybe you'll see then cuts to storylines and scenes that are taking place in the past. So at first glance, this might seem like the filmmaker, Yoshida, is taking two separate storylines and then mixing them together in a way of editing. Okay, but one can also imagine the possibility that perhaps the past storyline might be Eiko's view on history. In other words, maybe it's Eiko's imagining of the past. Maybe it's also the past trying to assert itself into the present. Maybe it's a combination of the two, and maybe it's none of the above. Who knows? And the reason why it's so complicated and difficult, and therefore very fascinating, is also because in various moments of the film, we get scenes of past characters, like Noe Ito coming to Tokyo for the first time. I see a scene in the film where she is riding a modern-day Shinkansen train to Tokyo. Now, of course, that doesn't make sense in the purely historical context, because modern-day trains didn't exist in 1912. But this is a very interesting way in which the past and the present collide. And this can be subject to many interpretations. Is this Noe Ito's force of will almost imposing itself on the present? Or is this Eiko's way of viewing the past? In other words, maybe Eiko is viewing the past in a way that is contextualizing the past against the backdrop of the present. You know, sometimes whenever I think of the past, sometimes I might think of it in terms of maybe people interacting in the past, but the background is like a present-day city or something like that. You know, that sort of thing can happen. And I think that possibility that Eiko is thinking of past personages against the backdrop of present-day surroundings, I think is very possible. And if that's the case, then that creates a lot of interesting potential in terms of how the film can be seen to be dealing with the past, and how the film can be seen to be trying to create a discussion about how people in the present can use the past, how people in the present can somehow try to reconcile themselves with the past. And this is incredibly significant when we recall that in both the present story and the past story, we are dealing with characters that are in some form or another in a situation of a kind of struggle between one pole and another, whether it be individual and establishment, or in sort of basic political terms, left versus right, or maybe student protests versus an establishment conservative base, that sort of thing. So. And I think the list can go on. So I think if we think of it in those terms, therefore, there are many parallels that can be made with the past, and also between present and past. There are also many things that one might try to learn from the past. Whether those lessons are learned effectively or not is really up to one's imagination and one's interpretation, of course. And so therefore, if we think of it in those terms, we can be left to wonder if indeed Eiko, the young woman in the current present day storyline, is really learning the history lessons of the past properly, or is she misconstruing them, or maybe is she misinterpreting them in a way that is not necessarily beneficial overall. I mean, after all, we do get moments in the past storyline where certain events seem to be thrown on their heads, so to speak, and things are being depicted in a way that there are multiple versions of certain events that come into question what might have happened and what it all meant. Did it even happen at all? And that sort of thing. And so that all goes into a very powerful and potent conversation and discussion about not only the dialectic and the tension that arises between past and present, but also how they interact, how they collide, and also how they are either compatible or perhaps not even compatible at all. And I think that is, in essence, what is at the heart of this film, EROS plus Massacre. And so you can come away with this with a sense of sort of confusion and not quite knowing exactly where one is at the end of the film. But I think that is, in a way, a good place to be at the end of this film, because I would actually argue that the film does not present any easy answers to those difficult questions that I would suggest that it poses. And in fact, it suggests so much ambiguity that it forces one to feel a little bit, or maybe more than a little bit, of unease and uncertainty about what is happening and what has just happened. And I think that is part of the point of watching this film. And I think feeling that way is not a bad place to be. And I would actually insist, or not insist, but I would suggest that that is indeed a good place to be after watching this film, because there is a lot of complexity that does not yield easy answers, or it does not yield any answers very easily. And I think that's part of the point. So this is, in a nutshell, what I think EROS plus Massacre is. Now, I've been describing it in very sort of basic terms, and I am not at all an expert in Japanese cinema or Japanese history. So if you are looking for any further more elaborate and much more detailed and more appropriate discussions of the political implications of Osugi, or maybe the social history and social unrest of Japan in the 1950s and 1960s leading up to 1970, or if you're interested in the historical relationship between the U.S. and Japan from the post-war era up through to the end of the Cold War, etc., then I would suggest that there are many places to turn. You can start with the David Desser book, EROS plus Massacre. It has a great bibliography. Perhaps you can also go, as an example, a book that's cited in the David Desser book itself is a work by Thomas A. Stanley, which is called Osugi Sakae Anarchist in Taisho Japan, The Creativity of the Ego, published in 1982. Once again, Thomas A. Stanley, which is cited in the book by David Desser called EROS plus Massacre, an introduction to the Japanese New Wave cinema. So you can go there. There are, of course, many other places that you can turn. And so this is just my way of suggesting to you that what I've said is the tip of the iceberg. Not even. It's the tip of the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg, which is to say that I can't even claim to have barely scratched the surface, because this is much deeper than anything I could ever even hope to try to explain even 1/10 of. That being said, there is still much to cling to, I would assert, and this can be approached in purely intuitive terms, and it can also be approached, of course, in a more approach that is based in a historical and political context. And either way, my friends, I think the viewing is potentially extremely, extremely rewarding, and I certainly hope it provided a very rewarding experience for you when you saw the film. So, my friends, this is, in essence, my view, or my thoughts and comments on the film EROS plus Massacre. So, what do you think about this film? Do you like this film? Are you fascinated by this film? Are you perhaps not so fascinated by this film? What do you think? Either way, my friends, I'd be very interested to hear what it is you have to say about this this really extraordinary work of art. That is EROS plus Massacre, the film by Kiju Yoshida, which is included in the Love plus Anarchism set from Arrow Academy. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. So please, maybe in a later video, please let me share some thoughts I have about a very interesting work by Yoshida, which is also included in this box set, which is called, in English, Heroic Purgatory. So until then, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, thank you and cheers.